All right, Joseph Bruen here with the All Access Entertainment Podcast. We are here with the great Keith Elliot Greenberg. Keith, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for calling me great.
Oh, without a doubt. Fantastic author. You've put out so many great pieces over the years. And speaking of that, let's talk about your latest ventures. Of course, Bigger, Better, Badder. You know, the whole story of WrestleMania 3. Why don't you tell us what that book is all about and what people can expect?
Well, that book came out in March. It's I don't know how many books I've already written for ECW Press, but they may be the #1 wrestling publisher in the world. I'm very fortunate in that executive editor, Michael Holmes, is a major wrestling fan. I mean, he is a fan like we are. He watches all the shows. We, mark out literally talking about wrestling together. And so, he's indulged me as I wrote a book in 2020 called Too Sweet Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution. Essentially, that traces the boom period of the indies leading to the formation of AEW. In 2023, I authored Follow the Buzzards, Pro Wrestling in the Age of 2019. Pro Wrestling in the Age of COVID-19. And that's all about the COVID era, which now seems to have faded from memory. But when I recently was skimming through it, I forgot about things like the Thunderdome, all the different devices promotions were using to get people intrigued by wrestling when they were holed up in their homes. And then in March of 2025, I did Bigger, Better, Badder, WrestleMania 3, and the Year It All Changed. And that is a book not just about WrestleMania 3 and how it transformed the industry, but about the industry in 1987, because the territories still existed. Jim Crockett Promotions had consolidated a lot of the old NWA, but people still had alternatives to WWE. But once WrestleMania 3 sold out an NFL stadium, it sent a resounding message to sponsors, licensees, media conglomerates that, WWE was big business. The other promotions weren't even in the running. And I think it also sent a message to fans that if you were a longtime fan, the message was, you've been right all along. If you were not really a fan, but had been drawn in by the rock and wrestling era, it sent the message that this is real entertainment and this is a viable option. And you shouldn't be ashamed for watching wrestling. Everybody does it.
And of course, your latest project, Random House, kind of covering the first 5 years of AEW. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, the book is called This Book Is All Elite. I was very privileged to have AEW approach me, which is always nice. And it's a coffee table book. So it's a ton of photos, great photos. Photos of everything you might remember from those first 5 years, as well as a lot of really cool behind the scenes photos. And it is, of course, it's a tribute to the first 5 years of AEW. But, there are a lot of backstories there, like, how certain tag teams came together, how certain storylines played out. And it's really interesting to examine the first 5 years of AEW in the context of the impact it's had on professional wrestling, because, no matter what anybody says, I know wrestling fans can be very tribal. Having AEW in the marketplace first of all, it brought in some of the best wrestlers in the world. I also think that just as WWE influences AEW, AEW has influenced WWE to the betterment of both products. And it's pretty clear, we cover, in the writing, I'm covering both people who were established names like Chris Jericho and John Moxley, and, later on Mercedes Moné, even Tony Storm, people who had been Ricochet, the Hurt Syndicate, all these folks who had been elsewhere. But we also were talking about people like Orange Cassidy, and let's not forget MJF, and Chris Statlander, who've become real stars as a result of having the AEW platform. And even when you look at people who've left, like Ricky Saints and Jade Cargill, those are people like, again, they were first highlighted in AEW. And so the impact is felt throughout the industry. And it's on the book ends 5 years in. So I sometimes find myself considering what's transpired in AEW since then. And it's quite a rich history. This is not, I think a lot of people were writing AEW off and they thought, okay, it'll be competitive for a while, or competitive, not that they're going to overtake WWE, but that they're going to draw eyeballs. And, now I truly believe there are people who are fervent AEW fans who are completely devoted to the product. And at the same time, there are people like myself who just love wrestling. And, we'll watch AEW and watch WWE and enjoy both.
And with so many great pieces over the years that you've put out, like, this next book coming out, where do you find the inspiration as a writer, to what's your personal process to kind of get in that zone and, get a new book out like that?
Well, I guess I put pressure on myself to always have a book in the works. It takes me a while to conceptualize which book I want to do and what the subject should be. And I like to be, I say this in almost every interview, I never wanted to become a nostalgia act. Because look, I wrote my first wrestling article in 1981. I started writing for WWE's publications in 1985. So that's a long time.
And how did you get your foot in the door with the World Wrestling Federation?
Well, I've been a fan my whole life. What I actually started doing is I became a freelance writer at age 19. And I knew a lot about wrestling. And this was a period before the Hulk Hogan era, when wrestling was not receiving mainstream publicity. And I remember I did a story on Bruno and David Sammartino for Us Weekly. And, wrestling didn't get that type of attention. And it kind of established me as a serious journalist who knew a lot about wrestling and could write about wrestling and loved wrestling. And as a result, I found myself at a very young age gaining access to events, which blew my mind. I mean, I remember around that period, going to Madison Square Garden and doing a story for the New York Daily News, which people, might find hard to believe at the time. I think it was the number 2 newspaper in the United States, or number 3 newspaper in the United States. And I did a sports centerfold, a Sunday sports centerfold on the pro wrestling phenomenon. Like, how is it that professional wrestling that, which at the time received no outside publicity, which was considered, a diversion more than a sports entertainment entity. How do they sell out Madison Square Garden every month? And I remember, I was pretty young, going backstage, and I get a photographer assigned to me, a really good photographer. And then somebody leaves. It might have even been Vince McMahon Sr. I said, "Oh, I'll get you someone to talk to you." And he brings in Bob Backlund. And it's like, wow, the champion is talking to me. And, it's like, how did I get myself here? And, I'm still there in a way.
Right. Fantastic opportunity right there. And, what's your earliest memory discovering pro wrestling? If you can remember back, very first time that you saw it.
It was always on. My grandparents were immigrants from the former Soviet Union. They were absolute true believers. They were Bruno believers. They, Bruno represented the immigrant. He wasn't just a representative of Italian immigrants. My grandfather was a Lithuanian Jew, but he related to Bruno because Bruno was, a guy who looked like he'd be working in a factory, working in a steel mill. He was an immigrant who had to take, who worked with his hands, and he wrestled larger guys. Bruno was muscular, but he'd get beaten down by a guy like Killer Kowalski or Don Leo Jonathan or Nikolai Volkov, Fritz Waldo von Erich, Gorilla Monsoon when he was a villain. And you'd be like, "Bruno, get up, get up." And it was like someone was actually like beating up your like grandfather, to watch that. And then he'd rally and, he didn't hulk up, but it was similar to hulking up. Like he'd clench his fists and he'd grit his teeth and he'd start to fight from behind. And there was something magical about that, especially being a child and believing in it. It truly was like seeing superheroes come to life, except in Bruno's case, he was a very relatable superhero. And so it had always been around. I mean, I remember being very young, seeing the original Sheik wrestle. And, now, of course, I don't think I ever bothered to question, hey, a person can't really throw fire in a fight, but it seemed believable enough at the time.
Right,
Just,
exactly.
sometimes your brain's just not developed. I'm sure, they're like when Oscar now sprays mist at somebody, I'm sure that there's a 6 or 7-year-old kid going like, wow, she's like mysterious and she sprayed mist in somebody's face just now.
Yeah, exactly. And so when it comes to the McMahon family, what are your personal interactions with Vince Sr. or Vince Jr., a little bit of both over the years, and how different were they from each other?
Well, they were different personalities. Everyone's an individual. Vince Sr. on the surface came across as distinguished, soft-spoken whenever I dealt with him, a gentleman. I mean, look, it's the wrestling business. I know from, doing research, there were always nefarious activities going on in every promotion behind the scenes. But, I found Vince Sr. very charming. And, and he was a guy, Steve Taylor, the former WWE photographer, points this out in Bigger, Better, Badder. He was someone who you just instinctively called Mr. McMahon. You wouldn't say, "Hey, Vince." He wasn't that kind of a man. He was always well dressed. His hair was coiffed very well, and he carried an authority. I even have a memory of going to a show at the Garden with my father, and some fans, they weren't really brawling, but they were pushing and shoving. And Vince Sr. came out, and he was very tall and stately. And he walked over to these fans and he knew one of the guys' names. And he said, "Come on, let's keep it down, please." He said it very nicely. And the fans were just in awe. And, he was able to diffuse that situation very quickly. Vincent Kennedy McMahon, the son, he never liked being called Junior. He was as you know, far more bombastic than his father. In terms of his ambition, I don't think there had been anybody who possessed both that ambition and the ability to realize it until arguably Tony Khan. Because, Tony Khan's a fan just like we are, but he had the resources and he had the vision. And look what he's done in the last 5 years.
Right. Any particular pieces, articles in WWF Magazine that stand out that you were a part of that, you kind of look back at and you're like, that was a really good piece?
It's more the experience. And again, like some people say, well, what was your best interview? I mean, I consider it more than interviews. I consider what I do establishing long-time relationships. When I was writing Bigger, Better, Badder about an event in 1987, I'm speaking to people like Jacques Rougeau and, the B. Brian Blair and Jim Brunzell, people who appeared on those shows. And I'm also, speaking to executives who were behind the scenes and organizing that event. But if there was any one assignment that really screams out at me, and I was talking about to Natty Neidhart about this recently. It was when I was assigned to go up to Stu Hart's house and be with the entire Hart family and, spend a few days with them. And that was really, for a lifetime fan like myself, a privilege. And Stu brought me into the dungeon, which is notorious. And it was, people were, he was well known for torturing people who maybe were questioning wrestling's legitimacy. But I had explained to Stu, look, I'm not a professional athlete. I'm not a tough guy. I believe in what you do. And so I appreciate it if you don't hurt me, but I really also would like you to show me some of the moves that you've taught generations of wrestlers. And he did. And I have a photo of it somewhere. And he put me in holds. He didn't clamp down. He didn't stretch me, but he would apply it just enough so I could feel the potential pain. And then he and I went upstairs into the living room and we just spoke. It was really him speaking and me listening. And it's not because he was overwhelming me with the conversation, but because all I could do was listen, because I just wanted to absorb everything.
And there have been so many great feuds over the years in pro wrestling. Is there a favorite that comes to mind, your personal favorite?
There's so many great ones. I mean, like I think of all the great matches I've seen and the great matches I haven't seen. Like, I always think about this and I bring this up. I wasn't living in the Carolinas at the height of Steamboat and Flair just going at each other every night. I can't even imagine how good those must have been. I later on remember Flair's great match with Terry Funk, the I Quit match. But I wasn't around in the NWA to see all those classic Dory Funk Jr. and Jack Briscoe matches. There's so much I've read about over the years. I wasn't, if I was alive at the time, I was so young, I didn't really see Antonina Rocca and Buddy Rogers go around with each other. You think about, I co-wrote Freddie Blassie's book. Imagine to be there live in Japan for Ricky Dozan versus Freddie Blassie must have been an experience unlike any other. And then, in the years that I've been covering wrestling, there was the great series with Bret and Shawn, even though there was tension in real life, it was fantastic. There was, whatever you want to say about Hulk Hogan's working ability, he actually could pull off a pretty intense match. And I thought him and Randy Savage for that, both when Savage came in as a contender and later on when they had the mega powers and they turned on each other. That was really intriguing. Um, all those great matches with The Undertaker when, at the tail end of his career, when he was trying to keep the streak going. The retirement match between Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker. There have been so many of them. I mean, look, we just saw, if we want to go to AEW, you have Hangman and Swerve Strickland have had some great matches, and they may not be over yet. We've seen Will Ospreay and Swerve go at it. You have Hangman Adam Page and Moxley had a killer of a match recently. So there's been so much great wrestling, and there is so much great wrestling. I don't know if I can just stop and say this is the best of all time.
And what's that? The element of hardcore wrestling has recently been brought back by AEW, specifically by Jon Moxley himself. So, a lot of his matches have kind of taken it to the next level. Everybody's talking about it. What's your take on that, on hardcore wrestling kind of coming back?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, just recently at Wrestle Dream, we saw Moxley and Darby. And from what I read, I wasn't there. I guess the athletic commission in St. Louis or Missouri didn't want there to be blood. So they did a hardcore match without them bleeding all over the place. And I mean, there was blood because it's inevitable when you're hitting, putting your body through that. You are going to open some flesh. But, hardcore wrestling, I mean, there are many types of wrestling. There's comedy wrestling. There's technical wrestling. There's a shoot style wrestling that looks like MMA. You go to Josh Barnett's Bloodsport. And, hardcore wrestling has always had its place. In ECW, we saw a great deal of that. And, as long as the talent is into it. I mean, now we take a ladder match for granted. I just watched the TNA match, like the most likely the final, TLC match with the Hardys and the Dudleys. Both these are guys, they're middle-aged, well into middle age now. And that was still a thrilling match. Yeah. So we almost take a ladder match for granted, like it's not considered a hardcore match. I mean, like getting flipped off a ladder, that's pretty hardcore. So in some ways, it's become ingrained into professional wrestling culture. Some people don't like the stuff that's excessively bloody, and I don't criticize them for that. Everything's a matter of personal taste. There are certain characters in wrestling who, like, I find Dominic Mysterio immensely entertaining and very funny. And maybe somebody else would say, oh, it's the same old gimmick and he's doing the same shtick every week. I don't know. I'm always amused by that. I find the tensions in the Judgment Day very, very funny and entertaining. I hear other people say, oh, too much of the Judgment Day. Or, people who watch AEW will criticize, oh, not the Death Riders, having a hardcore match again. I'm sure there's people who criticize Darby Allin. I find Darby Allin one of the most fascinating professional wrestlers. And, and I find his backstory intriguing. And, having had the pleasure of interviewing him for the AEW book, he's also a really interesting, cool guy who I think anybody would benefit from having a conversation with.
And World Wrestling Entertainment over the years have had some great working relationships, whether it be Smoky Mountain Wrestling or ECW, the USWA, of course, among others. And, that kind of went away for a while. And we're kind of back there now where they've taken over AAA. and of course they're supporting TNA heavily and working relationship there. What's your take on that? Kind of getting back
and Noah in Japan. I think it's great. I mean, obviously I grew up during the territory era, so we all think about dream matches, and it's great to see WWE performers in AAA, and the people on a wider scale being introduced to the lucha style. And we're talking about characters who might be perceived as comedy characters, but a guy like Mr. Iguana, how popular he is just with American fans just by simply walking out to the ring. And it's a new era. I mean, Triple H has been in charge for a while now in terms of the creative end. And I think that WWE and AEW have rubbed off on each other. And let's give Tony Khan his due. He is the one who came up with the Forbidden Door concept. And I don't find it a coincidence that now the Forbidden Door is also open to a degree in WWE.
Right, exactly. So when it comes to magazines, obviously we are now in the digital age, but one of the true treats as a fan and as a kid growing up was, going to your local supermarket and you see the newsstand with all the different, whether it's PWI or Inside Wrestling, WWF. Do you think we'll ever see an era again where you're going to see magazines for pro wrestling, at a newsstand?
I write for one. I write for Inside the Ropes magazine in the UK. And I have to say, I go to a train station in England. I walk into the magazine store, and people, still read print in the UK, not as much as, in the past. But, just seeing it on a shelf, when I'm walking in the train station, if I'm going out to Gatwick Airport or something, it's really cool. And Inside the Ropes magazine, it's also, I'm saying this sincerely, I think in terms of the collection of writers, just their ability to write and report, Brian R. Solomon, who did the book on the original Sheik and the new book on Gorilla Monsoon. You have Finlay Martin. One person gave me a compliment. He once referred to Finlay Martin as the Keith Elliot Greenberg of England. But he's a really knowledgeable, seasoned pro wrestling reporter. You have Tom Forty, who also writes for the Telegraph and the Guardian in the UK. I mean, these are the writers who are writing, whose bylines accompany mine there. And I feel like I'm in rarefied company. And I feel, it elevates me to even be associated with a publication like that. Interestingly, there have been efforts. There is a digital edition of Inside the Ropes magazine. At least in the UK, people have told me they prefer to get the newsstand version. Maybe they get it by subscription, but they like having that paper copy there. And, look, I like to read paper books more than Kindle. I certainly see the appeal of that, sometimes I actually have two editions, recent editions of Inside the Ropes magazine at one of the two places where I live now. I'm actually holding it there on top of the laptop. So the next time I spend a little time there, I can, eat lunch and actually thumb through the pages and read everybody's articles.
I'm a big fan of physical media. So, hopefully we'll get to the point here in the States again someday where we can see that. So, it's always a treat for sure. When it comes to venues, obviously you grew up a New Yorker, Madison Square Garden, the Mecca. You had, front row access to that arena, and that's obviously the granddaddy of them all. But what are some of your favorite venues beyond that over the years?
There's so many. I mean, I was just talking about the UK. I mean, I was at both of the All-Ins at Wembley Stadium. It was fantastic. The the first one in particular, it felt like a European-wide celebration. I remember walking from the tube station across the plaza over to the stadium, and there were bars, along the way. And, I was hearing multiple languages spoken, and I ran into these guys. They were Swiss, but they spoke, a Swiss form of German. And I heard them very excitedly speaking to each other. And I couldn't understand most of what they were saying, even though I understand a little bit of German, but I didn't understand this version. And then one guy just went, "This is Sting." He did a Tony Schiavone imitation. So, it was the atmosphere there. And it's funny, I ran into these two guys on the tube going to the second All-In show from Ireland. And I ran into them this year, I believe, in Vegas at WrestleMania. So now, yes, they did. They met up with me. I ran into them, and then they met up with me and some of my friends. So, you're going to these big stadium shows. I mean, it's exhilarating just to be in a place where there's more than 60,000 people. I when I was very young, I do remember going to Maple Leaf Gardens at in Toronto. And what I recall about that, this was the period when I'm talking about very, very young in my career. It was the period when Frank Tunney was still the promoter there, and they had a relationship with Jim Crockett Promotions. I remember the main event was Ric Flair against Dick Slater. But I saw a young Bret Hart on that card, who I think was called Bret Loverboy Hart. Oh. And I saw like the K brothers, who Bret Hart likes to talk about. There were a lot of guys who were, Canadian stars who were on that show. And I remember at that venue, they had a ramp. Like now it's a standard thing, an elevated ramp that went to the ring, and thinking, wow, this is so cool. It's unprecedented. The thing is that now when you go to a major, PLE or pay-per-view, there's a stage. So it almost transcends the venue where it is, because it's the staging. And these shows, the larger shows, also happen to be international shows. So it's not just the local market anymore. And I bring that up in Bigger, Better, Badder. That was the beginning of it, WrestleMania 3, where people traveled to see shows. So it's not like, wow, that, that St. Louis crowd was so hot. I mean, sometimes you feel that. I went to see Rev Pro in London, and I also saw Progress in London. That was definitely, a British crowd, and it was pretty cool being there. I went to Sumo Hall in Japan. That was pretty great because you have the sumo tradition there. There's giant portraits of the sumo wrestlers, up on the sides of the arena, and you're watching wrestling there. So there, there's a lot of great venues.
And what's your point of view when it comes to WrestleMania 1, just the lead up to that, and how it all panned out, while you were new to the company there?
Well, I received my first assignment. Well, my relationship I had a relationship with WWE already. It was at WrestleMania 1. I was covering it for Us Weekly, and Ed Raschuti, who is quoted in Bigger, Better, Badder, was the editor of WWE's magazine. And he and I were chatting, and he had a background he was a former Marine, very well-traveled guy, had covered, elephant tusk poaching in Africa. He had spent time in Iran, and, so very erudite, but he had been a boxer at Notre Dame. And so we were chatting. I was picking his brain. He was, at least 20 years older than me. And, he was asking me to explain to him in kind of, you know, intellectual terms the appeal of wrestling to me. And then he said, why don't you start writing for us? And those are pretty significant words when you think about where my life ended up. But WrestleMania 1, you know, at first it felt like, okay, he's trying to overshadow Jim Crockett Jr., who's been having Starrcade. And, you know, there have been major shows. There was, of course, the Von Erichs had the Parade of Champions in Dallas outdoors. But this was different. You had A-list celebrities associated. I mean, Cyndi Lauper was the female diva of that year. Mr. T was perhaps the #1 television star that year. And you never saw this at wrestling before. You'd have people who they were either past their prime or they were C-listers, getting involved in wrestling shows. And these were, this was like the glamour people were involved in it. Even Liberace dancing with the Rockettes. You don't understand, 1985, that was a really big deal. And, those pictures ended up everywhere. And so that was what cracked the door open. It said, it sent the message like this is real entertainment. But I was even among those who thought it was still a fad, that pro wrestling would be hot for a while, or WWE would be, and then it would kind of, fade, and some other fad would come around. And WrestleMania 3 changed that, because once that NFL stadium was sold out, you also had the very compelling rivalry between Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. That's when it was institutionalized, that this is something that we're going to see for a long time. I didn't know it would be over 40 years, but I'm awfully happy that it's lasted that long.
And you've been a part of some big projects outside of the wrestling world. Geraldo at Large on Fox News, Forensic Files, America's Most Wanted, Dateline NBC. Tell us about that whole, thing. Out of wrestling, it's got to be much different, of course, in the entertainment industry. But tell us what that's all about.
Well, I mean, I do enjoy true crime quite a bit. As a kid, I was watching wrestling and like reading true crime stories. So it's not a coincidence that that I do cover true crime as a TV producer mainly now. I have written some true crime books, but mainly as a TV producer. But it's funny, like wrestling, there's crossover. When I talk to detectives, when I talk to sometimes even victims' families, they're either current wrestling fans or they've been wrestling fans. Prosecutor, I was in Iowa recently, and a prosecutor sent me to a place called the Flying Elbow in Marshalltown, Iowa, which was, it was a kitschy place devoted to 1980s wrestling. So it comes up. And likewise, when I'm talking to wrestlers sometimes, they're true crime fans. So, people aren't black and white. Everybody's complex. And so the different worlds I'm in do intersect from time to time. I mean, you listen to Busted Open Radio. And by the way, that's my next project. I'm currently researching a book about the phenomenon of Busted Open Radio and Pro Wrestling Nation 24/7. And, those guys sometimes spend time talking about heavy metal. When Ozzy Osbourne died, they devoted 3 hours talking about Ozzy Osbourne, and all these wrestling fans and wrestling people were calling in. So, we're part of a wider community. We're not so limited that we can only talk about one thing, whether it's our interests outside of wrestling or even the type of wrestling we like. Some guys are deathmatch guys. Some guys are comedy match guys. Some guys are AEW guys. And some people like myself, they're everything.
And when it comes to the managerial role, the 80s especially, but 80s, 90s, so colorful, whether it be Freddie Blassie, Lou Albano, the Grand Wizard, Jimmy Hart. I feel like it's a lost art now, the managers. There are still some, but it's not like it once was. What's your take on that?
Well, but then you see there are guys in AEW, they're, very strong managers. I mean, you have the Don Callis family. Don Callis is a pretty big character there, and he's at the center of, a lot of pandemonium. You have Stokely Hathaway, who I think is, I think his best years are ahead of him. I think I loved him when he was in NXT, and I think he's a great speaker, and he's funny, and he can bump. So yes, it's a lost art, but I do believe there is potential for that art to come to the surface again.
And for fans that are listening in, how can fans follow you as far as wanting to purchase your books and of course social media?
I mean, I'm listed as Keith Elliot Greenberg, and I can be found. I mean, Facebook. Unfortunately, I think you can only have 5,000 friends on Facebook, so I'm constantly going through Facebook because people are friending me, and I'm like saying, "Oh, I don't really know this person. I'll have to eliminate this person." Or, this kid I went to junior high school with, but I didn't really know him, and we never communicate with each other. I'll have to trim it down a little bit to bring more people in. But I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, and so I can be found on all of those. And if you want any of my books, I mean, the easiest way is you just go to Amazon and you type in my name, and there's going to be a ton of books will come up.
Excellent. And do you think there'll ever be a physical Hall of Fame within the WWE?
There's been talk about it for so many years. I remember one time there was a rumor that Bill Apter was going to, oversee that project, which would have been wonderful because, Bill Apter is an American treasure. I don't know. Or maybe it'll be a touring Hall of Fame. I mean, you go to WWE World at some of these major events, and that is, it's a touring WWE museum, and it's pretty damn cool. And the archivist there is he's just masterful, and he's found just the greatest memorabilia, and and now with video components, and you go these things, there's live chats with the talent, past and present, and so it's really a moving experience. So will there be a physical Hall of Fame in Toledo, Ohio? I don't know. Maybe it's, foolhardy to put it confine it to one place.
Sure. And what advice do you have for any upcoming, aspiring producers or writers?
Put in the work. You may have to suck wind for a while. You may have to work for free or very cheaply in order to get your name in there. But, if you're devoted to your craft, I have my oldest kid is a working filmmaker. My 21-year-old daughter is a tattoo artist. And I've always said to them, give yourself to the art and the money will hopefully follow.
And after this life, how do you want to be remembered? What do you want your legacy to be?
Well, I intend to be resurrected. So I know. I want my legacy to live in the books I've written. And, I don't know if there'll be public libraries in 100 years, but there'll be something where people can access my books. And so, it doesn't I can read a book by a great author, and it doesn't matter if the person's been dead 100 years, it's their voice still lives. And so I'm gratified that I've had a career where people will be reading my voice and learning about the one true sport, as it's called, because of me, years after I'm gone. but I don't intend to be gone for a long time.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Keith Elliot Greenberg, today here on the All Access Entertainment Podcast. I've been your host, Joseph Bruen. We'll be right back with the bonus segment, so stay tuned for Overtime.